Executives. The executive office carries out the laws and policies of a state. In many countries, the executive is split into two distinct roles, the head of state and the head of government. The head of state is a role that symbolizes and represents the people, both nationally and internationally, and may or may not have any real policy-making power. The head of government deals with the everyday tasks of running the state, and usually directs the activities of other members of the executive branch. The distinction is clearly seen in a country such as Britain, where formerly powerful monarchs reigned over their subjects, but left others, such as prime ministers, in charge of actually running the country. Today, Britain still has a monarch that is head of state, but the real power rests with the prime minister, who is head of government. Likewise, the Japanese emperor still symbolically represents the nation, but the prime minister runs the government. In the United States, both roles are combined into one position, the president. However, in other countries, such as Italy and Germany, the president is the head of state with weak powers, and the prime minister is the head of government. In still others, such as Russia and France, the president is head of state with strong powers, and the prime minister is the head of government with subordinate powers. Although the relationship in Russia has changed, depending on whether Vladimir Putin was president or prime minister. Functions of the chief executive. Usually the chief executive is the most important person in the policy-making process, initiating new policies and playing an important role in their adoption. In presidential system, the president usually has the power to veto legislation, while the executive in a parliamentary system usually does not have that authority. The political executive also oversees policy implementation and can hold other officials in the executive branch accountable for their performance. The central decisions in a foreign policy crisis are generally made by the chief executive. The cabinet. In parliamentary systems, the cabinet is the most important collective decision-making body. Its ministers head all the major departments into which the executive branch is divided, and the cabinet is led by the prime minister, or first among equals. The ministers are also leaders of the majority party in parliament, or if the country has a multi-party system with no clear majority party, a cabinet coalition will form, where several parties join forces and are represented in different cabinet posts. A common problem of cabinet coalitions is that they tend to be unstable, especially if they result from a fragmented legislature. In presidential systems, the president chooses the cabinet members from almost any area of political life, and his appointments may have to be approved by the legislature, as with the U.S. Senate. Because the cabinet members are not necessarily party leaders or members of the legislature, they often have more independence from the president than ministers do from the prime minister. However, the president usually has the power to remove them from office, so they can't stray too far from the president's wishes. Bureaucracies. Bureaucracies consist of agencies that generally implement government policy. They usually are part of the executive branch of government. Their size has generally increased over the course of the 20th and early 21st centuries, partly due to the government efforts to improve the health, security, and welfare of their populations. German political philosopher Max Weber created the classic conception of bureaucracy as a well-organized, complex machine that is a rational way for a modern society to organize its business. He did not see bureaucracies as necessary evils, but as inevitable organizational responses to a changing society. According to Weber, a bureaucracy has several basic characteristics. Hierarchical authority structure. The chain of command is hierarchical. The top bureaucrat has ultimate control, and authority flows from the top down. Task specialization. A clear division of labor means that every individual has a specialized job. Extensive rules. All people in the organization follow clearly written, well-established formal rules. Clear goals. All people in the organization strive toward a clearly defined set of goals. The merit principle. Merit-based hiring and promotion requires that no jobs be granted to friends or family unless they're the best qualified. Impersonality. Job performance is judged by productivity, or how much work the individual gets done. Bureaucracies have acquired great significance in most contemporary societies and often represent an important source of stability for states. Bureaucracies in democracies. Max Weber formulated these characteristics of bureaucracies with European democracies in mind. He was less than enthusiastic about their growing importance, largely because of the alienation that he believed they created among workers. A modern issue has to do with discretionary power given to bureaucrats, the power to make small decisions in implementing legislative and executive decisions. These small decisions arguably add up to significant policymaking influence. But democratic beliefs require decisions to be made by elected officials, not by appointed bureaucrats. Yet the bureaucracy is often an important source of stability in a democracy, since the elected officials may be swept out of office and replaced by new people with little political experience. The bureaucrats stay on through the changes in elected leadership positions, and as a result, they provide continuity in the policymaking process. Bureaucracies in authoritarian regimes. Bureaucracies in authoritarian regimes differ from those in democracies in that the head of government exercises almost complete control over their activities. For example, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin placed his own personal supporters, members of the Communist Party, in control of bureaucratic agencies, such as the secret police and the network of political commissars who served as watchdogs over the military. These bureaucracies not only managed the economy but directly controlled vast resources, including human labor, and the number of prisoners in labor camps under secret police administration increased dramatically under Stalin's rule. Executive power over the bureaucracy was questioned in the 19th century in the United States, when presidents had a great deal of control over government jobs under the patronage system, in which political supporters received jobs in return for their assistance in getting the president elected. However, this system was reformed after President James Garfield was assassinated by a disgruntled supporter and was gradually replaced by a merit-based system meant to curtail the president's patronage powers. As a result, bureaucratic appointments come to abide by more democratic, less authoritarian rules. Other examples of bureaucratic authoritarian regimes developed in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay during the 1960s and 1970s. In these Latin American countries, a military regime formed a ruling coalition that included military officers and civilian bureaucrats, or technocrats. The coalition seized control of the government and determined which groups were allowed to participate. The authoritarian leaders were seen as modernizers seeking to improve their country's economic power in the world economy. They controlled the state partly in the name of efficiency. Democratic input into the government was seen as an obstacle in the modernization process, and so the governments in these countries have often been oppressive. Common characteristics of bureaucracies. All bureaucracies, whether they are democratic or authoritarian, tend to have many features in common. Non-elected positions. Bureaucrats are appointed, usually salaried, and are not elected by the public. Impersonal, efficient structures. Bureaucracies tend to be impersonal because they are goal-oriented and have little concern for personal feelings. Bureaucracies are meant to be efficient in accomplishing their goals. Formal qualification for jobs. Although authoritarian leaders may appoint whoever they want to government positions, they must at least factor in formal qualifications, education, experience, in making their appointments. Otherwise, a bureaucracy cannot fulfill its goals of efficiency and competent administration. Most democracies have institutionalized formal qualifications as prerequisites for appointments to the bureaucracy. Hierarchical organization. Most bureaucracies are hierarchical, top-down organizations in which higher officials give orders to lower officials. Everyone in the hierarchy has a boss except for the person at the very top. Red tape, inefficiency. Despite their common goal of efficiency, large bureaucracies seem to stumble under their own weight. Once a bureaucracy reaches a certain size and complexity, the orderly flow of business appears to break down, so that one hand doesn't appear to know what the other is doing. Legislatures. The legislature is a branch of government charged with making laws. Formal approval for laws is usually required for major public policies, although in authoritarian states, legislatures are generally dominated by the chief executive. Today, more than 80% of the countries belonging to the United Nations have legislatures, suggesting that a government that includes a representative popular component increases its legitimacy. Bicameralism. Legislatures may be bicameral, with two houses, or unicameral, with only one. The most usual form is bicameral, and may be traced to Britain's House of Lords and House of Commons. Despite the fact that one house is referred to as upper and the other as lower, the upper house does not necessarily have more power than the lower house. In the United States, it is debatable which house is more powerful than the other, and in Britain and Russia, the upper house has very little power. Why do most countries have a bicameral legislature? If the country practices federalism where power is shared between a central and subunit governments, bicameralism allows for one house, usually the upper chamber, to represent regional governments and local interests. Seats in the other chamber are usually determined by population, and so the body, usually the lower house, serves as a direct democratic link to voters. Bicameralism may also counterbalance disproportionate power in the hands of any region. For example, in the United States, populous states such as California, New York, and Texas have large numbers of representatives in the lower house, so the voices of citizens in those states are stronger than those in more sparsely populated states. However, that large state advantage is counterbalanced in the Senate, where all states are equally represented by 2 senators each. Even in a unitary state where all power is centralized in one place, bicameralism may serve to disperse power by requiring both houses to approve legislation. Some scholars view the upper house as a cooling-off mechanism to slow down impulsive actions of the hot-headed lower house that is directly elected by the people. Memberships in the legislature may be determined in different ways, with many houses being directly elected by voters. However, others are selected by government officials, or their membership is made determined by political parties. The 6 core countries offer a variety of contrasting methods for determining legislative membership. Functions of legislatures. Assembly members formulate, debate, and vote on political policies. They often control the country's budget in terms of both fundraising and spending. Some assemblies may appoint important officials in the executive and judicial branches, and some, such as the House of Lords until 2009, have served as a court of appeal. They may also play a major role in elite recruitment, i.e., identifying future leaders of the government, and they may hold hearings regarding behaviors of public officials. Regarding policymaking, legislatures in different countries hold varying degree of power. For example, the U.S. Congress plays a very active role in the formulation and enactment of legislation. In contrast, the National People's Congress of the People's Republic of China is primarily a rubber stamp organization for policies made by the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Judiciaries. The judiciary's role in the political system varies considerably from one country to another. All states have some form of legal structure, and the role of the judiciary is rarely limited to routinely adjudicating civil and criminal cases. Courts in authoritarian systems generally have little or no independence, and their decisions are controlled by the chief executive. Court systems that decide the guilt or innocence of lawbreakers go back to the days of medieval England, but constitutional courts serve to defend democratic principles of a country against infringement by both private citizens and the government are a much more recent phenomena. The Constitutional Court is the highest judicial body that rules on the constitutionality of laws and other government actions. In some states, the judiciary is relatively independent of the political authorities in the executive and legislative branches. It may even have the authority to impose restrictions on what political leaders do. Judicial review, the mechanism that allows courts to review laws and executive actions for their constitutionality, was well established in the United States during the 19th century. But it has developed over the past decades in other democracies. The growth of judicial power over the past century has been spurred in part by the desire to protect human rights. Some have criticized the acceptance of the Constitutional Court in liberal democracies today, saying that the judges are not directly elected, so they do not represent the direct will of the people. Despite these developments, the judiciary is still a relatively weak branch in most of the 6 core countries of the comparative government and politics course, but it takes a different form in each of them. Linkage institutions. In many countries, we may identify groups that connect the government to citizens, such as political parties, interest groups, and print and electronic media. Appropriately, these groups are called linkage institutions. Their size and development depends partly on the size of the population and partly on the scope of government activity. The larger the population and the more complex the government's policy-making activities, the more likely the country is to have well-developed linkage institutions. parties. The array of political parties operating in a particular country and the nature of the relationship among them is called a party system. Political parties perform many functions in democracies. First, they help bring different people and ideas together to establish the means by which the majority can rule. Second, they provide labels for candidates that have helped citizens decide how to vote. Third, they hold politicians accountable to the electorate and other political elites. Most democracies have multi-party systems, with the two-party system in the United States being a more unusual arrangement. Communist states have one-party systems that dominate the governments, but non-communist countries have also had one-party systems. An example is Mexico, during most of the 20th century when it was dominated by the PRI. The two-party system is a rarity, occurring in only about 15 countries in the world today. The United States has had two major political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, throughout most of its history. Although minor parties do exist, historically those two parties have had the only reasonable chance to win national elections. The most important single reason for the existence of a two-party system is the plurality electoral system. Most European countries today have multi-party systems. They usually arise in countries with strong parliamentary systems, particularly those that use a proportional representation method for elections. Electoral systems and elections. Electoral systems are the rules that decide how votes are cast, counted, and translated into seats in a legislature. All democracies divide their populations by electoral boundaries, but they use many different arrangements. The United States, India, and Great Britain use a system called first past the post, in which they divide their constituencies into single-member districts, in which candidates compete for a single representative seats. It's also called the plurality system, or the winner-take-all system, because a winner does not need a majority to win, but simply must get more votes than anyone else. In contrast, many countries use proportional representation that creates multi-member districts, in which more than one legislative seat is contested in each district. Onto proportional representation, voters cast their ballots for a party rather than a candidate, and the percentage of votes a party receives determines how many seats the party will gain in the legislature. South Africa and Italy use a system based solely on proportional representation, and many countries, including Germany, Mexico, and Russia until 2007, have used a mixed system that combines first past the post and proportional representation. For example, in Mexico, 300 of the 500 members of the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house, are elected to the winner-take-all system from single-member districts, and 200 members are selected by proportional representation. Plurality voting systems encourage large, broad-based parties because no matter how many people run in the district, the person with the largest number of votes wins. This encourages parties to become larger, spreading their umbrellas to embrace more voters. Parties without big groups of voters supporting them have little hope of winning, and often have a hard time getting their candidates listed on the ballot. In contrast, the proportional representation electoral system encourages multiple parties because they have a good chance of getting some of their candidates elected. This system allows minor parties to form coalitions to create a majority vote so the legislation can be passed. Democracies also vary in types of elections that they hold. A basic distinction between a presidential and parliamentary system is that the president is directly elected by the people to the position, and the prime minister is elected as a member of the legislature. The prime minister becomes head of government because she or he is the leader of his or her party or coalition. In general, these types of elections are found in democracies. Election of public officials. The number of elected officials varies widely, with thousands of officials elected in the United States and far fewer in most other democracies. However, even in a unitary state, many local and regional officials are directly elected. Legislatures are often directly elected both on the regional and national levels. Now, citizens of many European countries also elect representatives to the European Union's Parliament. Lower houses are more likely to be directly elected than upper houses, with a variety of techniques used for the latter. Referendum. Besides elections to choose public officials, many countries also have the option of allowing public votes on a particular policy issues. A ballot called by the government on a policy issue is called a referendum. Such votes allow the public to make direct decisions about policy itself. Referenda exist only on the state and local level in the United States and Canada, but many other countries have used them nationally. The French and Russian presidents have the power to call referenda, and they have sometimes had important political consequences. For example, when a referendum proposed by French President Charles de Gaulle failed, he resigned his office in reaction to the snub by the voters. In Russia, the Constitution of 1993 was presented as a referendum for approval by the voters. In Britain, devolution of powers to the Scottish and Welsh parliaments was put before the voters in those regions in the form of referenda. The European Constitution failed because it was voted down in referenda in the Netherlands and France. A variation of a referendum is a plebiscite, or a ballot to consult public opinion in a non-binding way. Initiative. Whereas referenda are called by the government, an initiative is a vote on a policy that is initiated by the people. Although less common than a referendum, the initiative must propose an issue for a nationwide vote, and its organizers must collect a certain number of supporting signatures from the public. The government is then obliged to schedule a vote. Interest groups. Interest groups are organizations of like-minded people whose main political goal is to influence and shape public policy. In liberal democracies, interest groups that are independent from the government are usually an important force in the maintenance of a strong civil society. Groups may be based on almost any type of common interest: occupation, labor, business interests, agriculture, community action, ethnic identities, or advocacy for a cause. Groups may be formally organized on a national level, or they may work almost exclusively on the local level. Interest groups often have non-political goals too. For example, a business group might organize to promote the growth of its products by directly advertising them to the public. Most interest groups have a political side too that focuses on influencing the decisions that governments make. Differences between parties and interest groups. Parties and interest groups have a great deal in common because they represent political points of view of various people who want to influence policymaking. However, some significant differences still exist. Parties influence government primarily through the electoral process. Although they serve many purposes, parties always run candidates for public office. Interest groups often support candidates, but they do not run their own slate of candidates. Another important difference is that parties generate and support a broad spectrum of policies. Interest groups support one or a few related policies. In a multi-party system, however, parties with a narrow base of interest tend to appear. For example, a number of green parties have appeared in many European party systems that have a particular interest in environmental issues. The strength of interest groups. An important factor in assessing how important interest groups are in setting public policy is to determine the degree of autonomy they have from the government. To exercise influence on public policy, groups need to be able to independently decide what their goals are and what methods they will use to achieve them. In authoritarian states, groups have almost no independence. For example, in China, only government-endorsed groups may exist.